Miss Marple and the Crochet Hook Crime. Dear listeners, welcome back to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Edward, and I'm truly happy you're here with us tonight. It's wonderful how these stories bring us together, no matter where we are in this big, wide world. If you'd like, write in the comments and let me know where you're listening from. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe for new mysteries every day. Now grab your coffee or tea and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Crochet Circle Invitation. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her spectacles and read the elegant cream-coloured note for the third time that morning. The paper bore the distinctive watermark of Turnham Hall, and the handwriting was undoubtedly that of Lady Alicia Turnham herself. Rather spidery now, Miss Marple observed with the practised eye of one who had watched many hands grow frail with age. "My dear Miss Marple," the letter began, "I do hope you will forgive the short notice, but I find myself in need of your particular expertise. We are inaugurating a crochet circle here at the Hall this Thursday evening with the noble purpose of raising funds for our local war widows. Your reputation as a needlewoman of exceptional skill has reached even our remote corner of the county, and I should be most honoured if you would join our little gathering. The evening will conclude with a modest auction of handwork and curiosities, all in aid of our worthy cause. Do say you will come. We shall send the pony trap for you at 6:30. Your devoted neighbour, Alicia Turnham." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her teacup. How very curious. She had met Lady Alicia only once, at the Harvest Festival in Much Benham, and while their conversation had touched briefly upon the merits of various stitching techniques, she hardly thought herself sufficiently renowned to warrant such a gracious invitation. Still, the cause was worthy, and Miss Marple had always found that a change of scene often provided the most interesting insights into human nature. The afternoon was crisp and clear, as Miss Marple settled herself into the rather ancient pony trap that Lady Alicia had indeed sent for her. Young Tom Fielding, who served as groom and general factotum at the Hall, clicked his tongue encouragingly at the equally ancient pony. "Bit of excitement up at the Hall, miss," Tom confided as they jogged along the narrow lane. "Her ladyship's been in such a flutter about this crochet business. Mind you, times have been hard since the master passed. The Hall's not what it was, if you take my meaning," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically. She had heard whispers in the village about the Turnham family's reduced circumstances, though Lady Alicia maintained her dignity with the sort of determined grace that Miss Marple rather admired. Turnham Hall loomed before them as they rounded the final bend, its Jacobean facade weathered but still impressive in the gathering dusk. Ivy clung to the warm stone walls, and lights glowed welcomingly in the tall windows. Miss Marple noted with interest that while the building showed signs of genteel neglect, a loose shutter here, missing roof tiles there, someone had taken great care with the gardens. The late roses still bloomed bravely against the approaching winter, and the gravel drive was scrupulously raked. Lady Alicia herself greeted Miss Marple at the great oak door, and if her silk dress was perhaps a season or two out of fashion, her manner was as gracious as ever. She was a tall, handsome woman in her late 60s, with silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure that spoke of more prosperous times, when ladies' maids had leisure for such artistry. "My dear Miss Marple, how perfectly splendid that you could come. We are gathered in the morning room, so much cosier than the drawing-room for our purpose, and the light is better for close work." As they walked through the panelled corridors, Miss Marple's keen eyes took note of the telltale signs of a household economising. The faded rectangles on the walls where paintings had once hung, the careful darning in the Persian carpet, the way certain rooms were clearly closed off to save on heating. Yet everywhere there were signs of loving care. Fresh flowers in simple vases, furniture polished to a warm glow, brass fittings that gleamed despite their age. The morning room proved to be a charming chamber overlooking the gardens, where a cheerful fire crackled in the grate, and several ladies were already gathered around a large table, laden with work baskets and tea things. Lady Alicia performed the introductions with practised ease. "Miss Marple, may I present my niece, Miss Sylvia Turnham. Sylvia has recently become engaged to a most delightful young man, Squadron Leader Philip Morton. Sylvia Turnham was a striking young woman of perhaps 25, with dark hair, fashionably bobbed and intelligent green eyes. She wore a beautiful turquoise angora shawl that complemented her colouring admirably, though Miss Marple noted with interest that one of the long tassels appeared to have been recently mended. Sylvia's greeting was warm, but carried an undertone of nervous energy, as though she were preoccupied with weightier matters than crochet patterns. And this is Mrs. Grace Holloway, who so kindly agreed to instruct us in the finer points of lace crochet. Mrs. Holloway is quite famous locally for her exquisite work. Mrs. Holloway was a woman of middle years, neatly dressed in black bombazine that spoke of prolonged mourning. Her hands, Miss Marple observed, were those of a true craftswoman, long-fingered and supple, with the particular calluses that came from years of working with fine threads. There was something in her manner that suggested reduced circumstances born with quiet dignity, and Miss Marple's sympathetic heart warmed to her immediately. I am also delighted to introduce Mr. Bernard Cole, our local veterinary surgeon. Mr. Cole has developed quite an unexpected talent for needlework. One never knows where artistic ability may manifest itself. Mr. Cole was a pleasant-faced man of perhaps 30, with the sort of steady, reliable manner that Miss Marple associated with those who worked with animals. He seemed somewhat embarrassed by the attention, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes followed Sylvia Turnham with unmistakable devotion. A rather poignant situation, she reflected, given the young lady's recent engagement. And finally, we have Mr. Roger Pike, who travels throughout the county supplying the finest threads and implements to ladies such as ourselves. Mr. Pike has been most generous in contributing materials for tonight's auction. Mr. Pike was a well-dressed man of middle age, with the smooth manner of one accustomed to dealing with the gentry. His sample case lay open beside his chair, displaying an array of silks, wools, and implements that made Miss Marple's fingers itch to examine them more closely. There was something in his watchful gaze that reminded her of a cat studying a particularly interesting mouse-hole. As Miss Marple settled into her chair and accepted a cup of tea from Lady Alicia's trembling hands, she became aware of a sixth member of their party, a small, mousy-haired woman who moved so quietly about the room that one might easily overlook her presence entirely. "Oh, and that is Lily Harcourt, my lady's maid," Lady Alicia said, following Miss Marple's glance. "Lily has been with us for 15 years and has quite a gift for preserving and caring for fine textiles. She's entrusted with guarding our small collection of heirloom yarns and patterns." Lily bobbed a curtsy and continued her silent ministrations, refilling teacups and arranging the fire with practised efficiency. Miss Marple noted that despite her unassuming manner, the woman's eyes were sharp and observant, missing nothing that occurred in the room. The conversation flowed pleasantly as the ladies worked, punctuated by exclamations of admiration for particularly clever stitches or beautiful colour combinations. Miss Marple found herself genuinely enjoying the camaraderie, though she was aware of subtle undercurrents that suggested all was not entirely harmonious in this gathering. As the clock struck 8:30, Mr. Pike rose and cleared his throat importantly. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention, I should like to present the centrepiece of this evening's auction." From his sample case he withdrew a flat leather box which he opened with a flourish. Nestled in blue velvet lay a set of 6 crochet hooks, each carved from what appeared to be finest ivory, and fitted with delicate silver handles engraved with elaborate scroll-work. Even from across the room Miss Marple could see that they were exceptionally beautiful specimens, clearly the work of a master craftsman. "These hooks," Mr. Pike announced, "belong to the Duchess of Marlborough herself. They are said to date from the 1840s and are quite irreplaceable. I have been authorised to suggest a starting bid of £50 for the set." A murmur of appreciation ran around the room. Lady Alicia rose and examined the hooks with reverent fingers. "How absolutely exquisite," she breathed. "We must certainly keep them safe until the auction. Lily, please place them in the library cabinet. You know, the one with the good lock. We cannot be too careful with such treasures." As Lily carefully carried the box away, Miss Marple noticed that the wind had begun to rise outside, rattling the windows and sending autumn leaves dancing past the glass. The weather, which had been so pleasant during her journey, seemed to be taking a decided turn for the worse. "I do hope the weather holds," murmured Mrs. Holloway, glancing anxiously toward the windows. "It would be such a pity if the auction guests could not make their way here safely." "Oh, I'm sure it will be quite all right," Lady Alicia replied, though Miss Marple detected a note of uncertainty in her voice. "The glass has been steady all day." But even as she spoke, the first fat flakes of snow began to drift past the windows, and the wind gave a particularly fierce howl that seemed to promise more severe weather to come. Miss Marple pulled her shawl a little closer and reflected that it might prove to be a most interesting evening indeed. Chapter 2, A Corpse Among the Skeins. By 9 o'clock the snow was falling steadily, transforming the world beyond the windows into a swirling white curtain. The auction guests had arrived in reasonable numbers despite the weather, perhaps 24 souls from the surrounding countryside, all eager to support the worthy cause and examine the promised treasures. Miss Marple had counted them as they stamped their feet in the entrance hall, shaking snow from their coats and exclaiming over the sudden change in weather. The great hall had been arranged for the evening's entertainment, with chairs set in neat rows facing a small podium where Lady Alicia would conduct the auction. Display tables lined the walls, laden with an impressive array of handwork, embroidered cushions, knitted scarves, delicate doilies, and other fruits of feminine industry. The centrepiece, naturally, was the case containing the Duchess of Marlborough's ivory crochet hooks, which had been retrieved from the library cabinet and placed in a position of honour where all might admire them. Miss Marple had positioned herself in the third row, where she had an excellent view of both the proceedings and the participants. Squadron leader Philip Morton had arrived promptly at 8:30, a tall, handsome young man with the sort of confident bearing that came naturally to those who had faced danger in the skies above France. His greeting to Sylvia had been affectionate but somewhat perfunctory, Miss Marple thought, and she had noticed how his eyes lingered appreciatively on the more valuable items displayed for auction. The bidding had proceeded briskly, with items fetching respectable sums that would indeed provide meaningful assistance to the local war widows. Mrs. Holloway's exquisite lace collar had gone for £12 to a collector from Much Benham, and Mr. Cole's surprisingly accomplished needlepoint had earned £8, and considerable admiration from the assembled ladies. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple became increasingly aware of the storm's growing intensity. The wind howled around the ancient building with a voice that spoke of serious weather, and the snow was now driving against the windows with a persistence that suggested they might all find themselves stranded at the hall before the night was through. It was at precisely 10 minutes past 9. Miss Marple had just glanced at the ornate long-case clock in the corner when the lights began to flicker ominously. Lady Alicia paused in her description of a particularly fine piece of Berlin work, glancing upward with a frown of annoyance. "I do apologise," she said to the assembled guests. "The electrical system in the hall has always been rather temperamental, particularly during storms. I am sure it will settle in a moment." But the lights continued their erratic dance, growing dimmer with each flutter, until quite suddenly they failed altogether, plunging the great hall into complete darkness. A murmur of concern rippled through the gathered company, punctuated by the nervous laughter of those who hoped to make light of their predicament. "Stay calm, everyone," came Lady Alicia's voice from the darkness, admirably composed despite the circumstances. "Lily knows where the candles are kept. We shall have light restored in a moment." In the confused darkness that followed, Miss Marple heard the scraping of chairs, whispered conversations, and the general sounds of people attempting to orient themselves in unfamiliar surroundings. Someone, it sounded like Mrs. Holloway, called out that she had dropped her handbag and was searching for it on the floor. Mr. Pike's voice could be heard offering assistance to the ladies nearest him, while the general murmur of conversation provided a backdrop to the proceedings. The darkness seemed to last an eternity, though Miss Marple's practical mind told her it could not have been more than 2 or 3 minutes before Lily appeared with a branched candlestick, the warm light pushing back the shadows and revealing relieved faces throughout the room. Other servants followed with additional candles, and soon the hall was tolerably well illuminated, though the flickering light created dancing shadows that gave the proceedings an oddly theatrical quality. It was then that Sylvia's voice cut through the general conversation with a note of sharp concern. "Has anyone seen Philip?" He was here just before the lights went out, but I don't see him now." Miss Marple looked around the room with interest. Indeed, the young squadron leader was nowhere to be seen among the reassembled guests. The various ladies and gentlemen were all accounted for, but Philip Morton had quite definitely vanished. "Perhaps he stepped out to check on his motor car," suggested Mr. Pike helpfully. "The snow is coming down quite heavily now." "Or he may have gone to assist with the electrical difficulties," added Mrs. Holloway. "Young men are often eager to help with such practical matters." But before anyone could organise a proper search, the great oak door burst open with a violence that made several ladies cry out in alarm. Mr. Bernard Cole stood framed in the doorway, his face white as the snow that clung to his coat, his eyes wide with shock and something that looked very much like horror. "Lady Alicia," he said, his voice hoarse and strained, "I think you had better come at once, and perhaps someone should telephone for the police." The silence that followed his words was profound, broken only by the howling of the wind and the soft hiss of falling snow against the windows. Lady Alicia rose from her position at the podium, her face grave with sudden understanding. "What is it, Bernard? What has happened?" "It's Squadron Leader Morton," Bernard said, his professional composure cracking slightly. He's dead. I found him in the tapestry storeroom. He's been murdered." The word fell into the candlelit hall like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through the assembled company. Several ladies gasped, and one elderly guest appeared to be on the verge of swooning. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, but her blue eyes were sharp with interest as she observed the reactions of those around her. Sylvia Turnham swayed slightly, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might faint, but the young woman steadied herself against the back of a chair, her face pale but determined. What happened to him?" Bernard Cole's eyes met hers with infinite compassion. "He appears to have been stabbed, Miss Turnham, with one of those ivory crochet hooks." All eyes turned toward the display table where the Duchess of Marlborough's hooks had been so proudly exhibited. The case stood open, its blue velvet lining disturbed, and it was immediately apparent that the collection was no longer complete. Where 6 beautiful implements had nestled in perfect order, now only 4 remained. The spaces where the missing hooks had lain seemed to gape like wounds in the carefully arranged display. Lady Alicia moved toward the case with a measured tread that spoke of iron self-control. Upon closer examination, the extent of the vandalism became clear. Not only were 2 hooks missing entirely, but the glass front of the case had been smashed, and one of the remaining hooks showed a distinct bend in its delicate shaft, as though it had been subjected to considerable force. "The lock on the library cabinet has been forced as well," Lily reported quietly, having slipped away to investigate during the initial commotion. "Someone broke it open to get at the hooks." Miss Marple rose from her chair and approached the damaged display, with the sort of calm interest she might have shown in examining a particularly complex knitting pattern. While the others stood frozen with shock, she bent closer to study the scene, her keen eyes taking in every detail. "Interesting," she murmured, so quietly that only those nearest could hear. "The glass has been broken from the inside, not the outside. How very curious." Inspector Armitage would later confirm what Bernard Cole had already discovered, that Philip Morton lay dead in the tapestry storeroom, a small chamber adjacent to the great hall that housed the hall's collection of ancient hangings and rarely used furnishings. The ivory crochet hook had been driven into the base of his neck with considerable force, striking a vital artery. Death would have been almost instantaneous. But there were other details that caught Miss Marple's attention, as she was permitted a brief examination of the scene before the authorities arrived. Philip's gold pocket watch had stopped at 7 minutes past 9, its crystal cracked as though it had struck something hard during his final moments. Most peculiar of all were the odd scorch marks on the sleeve of his evening jacket, small dark patches that looked for all the world like the sort of burns one might sustain from an electrical mishap. Clinging to the bloodied ivory hook was a single strand of turquoise wool, fine and soft and unmistakably the same shade as Miss Sylvia's beautiful Angora shawl. As the full implications of the discovery began to sink in, Lady Alicia took charge with admirable efficiency. The remaining guests were gathered in the morning room, where they would be more comfortable while awaiting the arrival of the police. Telephone calls were made to the authorities in the market town of Welchester, though the duty sergeant warned that the roads were becoming increasingly treacherous, and it might be some time before officers could reach the hall. "We're quite snowed in," Tom Fielding reported after making a careful survey of the grounds. "The lane is completely blocked, and more snow falling every minute. No one will be leaving Turnham Hall tonight, that's certain." Miss Marple settled herself in a comfortable chair near the fire and regarded her fellow guests with thoughtful eyes. How very convenient for a murderer, she reflected, to have committed their crime just as nature provided the perfect means of preventing any escape. It suggested either remarkable luck or careful planning, and in Miss Marple's considerable experience, luck rarely played such a prominent role in matters of life and death. The storm showed no signs of abating. The ancient building creaked and groaned under the assault of wind and snow, and somewhere in their midst sat a killer who had struck once already. It promised to be a very long night indeed. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Counts the Stitches. While the gentlemen busied themselves with the practical matters of securing doors and windows against the storm, Miss Marple found herself naturally gravitating toward the ladies who had gathered in the morning room. It was curious, she reflected, how in times of crisis the sexes so often divided along traditional lines, the men feeling compelled to take action, however futile, while the women sought comfort in each other's company and the familiar rituals of tea and sympathy. Lady Alicia had regained her composure with admirable speed, though Miss Marple's experienced eye could detect the fine tremor in her hands as she poured tea from the silver service that had clearly seen better days. The poor woman was bearing up remarkably well under circumstances that would have prostrated many of her generation, but the strain was beginning to show around her eyes. "Such a dreadful business," Lady Alicia murmured, pressing a cup into Miss Marple's hands. "That poor, poor boy, and Sylvia ... Her voice trailed off as she glanced toward her niece, who sat rigid in a chair by the window staring out at the swirling snow with unseeing eyes. Mrs. Holloway had positioned herself at the small workable near the fire, her hands moving mechanically through the familiar motions of filet lace, as though the repetitive stitches might somehow restore order to a world gone suddenly mad. Miss Marple settled herself nearby, ostensibly to examine the intricate pattern Mrs. Holloway was creating, but in reality to observe the other occupants of the room with the sort of quiet attention that had served her so well in past difficulties. "Your work is quite exquisite," Miss Marple observed gently, leaning forward to admire the delicate mesh of threads. "Such perfect tension, and the pattern is remarkably complex. You must have been working on this piece for some time." Mrs. Holloway's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Yes, it's a pattern from my grandmother's collection. Filet lace depicting roses and forget-me-nots. Quite old-fashioned now, I suppose, but I find the traditional designs most satisfying." Miss Marple studied the work with the practised eye of one who had spent countless hours with needle and thread. The panel was indeed beautiful, executed with a sort of skill that came only from years of dedicated practice. But something about it troubled her, though she could not immediately identify what it might be. "How lovely that you've managed to accomplish so much this evening," she said conversationally, "despite all the excitement and unpleasantness." "Oh, I completed most of it before supper," Mrs. Holloway replied quickly. "I've been resting my eyes since then. This sort of close work can be quite taxing in artificial light." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, but her sharp eyes had already counted the rows, and she was quite certain that the panel now showed at least 3 additional rows of the intricate pattern, beyond what she had observed when they had first gathered for tea. If Mrs. Holloway had indeed been resting her eyes since supper, as she claimed, then how had those extra rows appeared? It reminded Miss Marple irresistibly of young Tommy Larkins back in St. Mary Mead, who had attempted to convince his mother that he had been diligently working on his school knitting project while she attended a church meeting. The boy had earnestly displayed the extra inches of scarf he claimed to have completed, not realizing that his mother had carefully noted the exact length before departing. Children, Miss Marple had often observed, were remarkably inventive when it came to deception, but they frequently overlooked the small details that betrayed their fabrications. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Lily, who moved about the room with her characteristic silent efficiency, refilling teacups and tending the fire. The little maid's face was pale but composed, and she performed her duties with a sort of mechanical precision that suggested she was using routine tasks to maintain her equilibrium in the face of shocking events. "Lily, dear," Lady Alicia said gently, "you needn't trouble yourself with serving tea just now. Perhaps you should rest. This has been a trying evening for us all." "Oh no, my lady," Lily replied in her soft voice. "I'd rather keep busy if you don't mind. It helps somehow." Miss Marple noticed that the girl's hands, like those of Mrs. Holloway, bore the telltale signs of one accustomed to fine needlework, the slight calluses on fingertips that came from handling delicate threads, the particular way she held her hands that spoke of countless hours spent in careful, close work. It occurred to her to wonder what projects Lily might pursue in her spare time, and whether she too had been working on something this evening. Sylvia Turnham rose abruptly from her chair by the window, pacing restlessly toward the fireplace. Her beautiful turquoise shawl had slipped from her shoulders, and Miss Marple observed with interest that the young woman's evening gloves bore small, dark marks near the fingertips, marks that looked remarkably similar to the scorch patterns they had observed on poor Philip's jacket sleeve. "I simply cannot understand it," Sylvia said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Who could have done such a terrible thing? And why? Philip was... he was..." She seemed unable to complete the sentence, pressing a gloved hand to her forehead in a gesture of distress. "There, dear," soothed Lady Alicia, rising to place a comforting arm around her niece's shoulders. "You mustn't torment yourself with such questions. I'm sure the police will sort everything out once they arrive." But Miss Marple found herself thinking of another young person from her past, little Mary Higgins, who had attempted to convince everyone that her burned fingers had come from helping her grandmother with the Christmas pudding, when in fact she'd been experimenting with her father's electrical equipment in the garden shed. The scorch marks on Mary's gloves had been remarkably similar to those Miss Marple now observed on Sylvia's elegant evening wear. The wind chose that moment to give a particularly fierce howl, rattling the windows and sending a downdraft through the chimney that made the fire flicker and dance. Lily moved quickly to adjust the screen, her practised hands steady despite the dramatic circumstances. "Such a dreadful storm," Mrs. Holloway murmured, glancing nervously toward the windows. "I do hope the police will be able to reach us before morning. It's rather unsettling knowing that someone among us..." She let the sentence hang unfinished, but her meaning was clear enough. Miss Marple had been thinking along similar lines. In her experience, murderers rarely struck just once when they felt themselves cornered, and their present situation, trapped together in an isolated country house with a killer among them, was precisely the sort of scenario that might prompt desperate action. It would be wise, she reflected, for everyone to remain in company and avoid venturing alone into the dark corners of the ancient building. "I wonder," she said thoughtfully, "whether anyone noticed anything unusual before the lights failed. Sometimes the most insignificant details can prove quite important in understanding what has occurred." Lady Alicia considered the question seriously. "I'm afraid I was quite focused on the auction items. The bidding was proceeding so well, and I was rather nervous about presenting the more valuable pieces properly." "Philip seemed quite normal when I spoke with him earlier," Sylvia offered, though her voice lacked conviction. He was interested in some of the items being auctioned, particularly the older pieces." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said with innocent interest. "Young people are often drawn to antiques, aren't they? There's something romantic about objects with a history. Did he mention any particular items that caught his fancy?" A look passed between Lady Alicia and her niece, so quick that someone less observant might have missed it entirely. But Miss Marple had spent many years watching for such subtle communications, and she filed the moment away for future consideration. "He admired the ivory hooks, naturally," Lady Alicia said carefully. "Everyone did. Such beautiful workmanship." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple, "and so valuable, I should imagine." Mr. Pike seemed quite confident they would fetch a substantial sum. The mention of Mr. Pike seemed to remind everyone of his absence from their gathering. He had remained in the great hall with the other gentlemen, presumably helping to secure the building and guard the scene of the crime. Miss Marple found herself wondering what observations the travelling merchant might have made during the evening's events, and whether his professional eye for valuable objects had noted anything significant. As if summoned by her thoughts, the door opened to admit Mr. Pike himself, brushing snow from his shoulders and stamping his feet on the threshold. His usually smooth demeanour appeared somewhat ruffled, and there was a grim set to his mouth that suggested unpleasant discoveries. "Ladies," he said, inclining his head respectfully, "I'm afraid the news is not encouraging. The telephone lines are down. The storm has brought down a tree across the main cable. We are quite cut off until the weather clears and repairs can be made." A collective sigh went up from the assembled ladies. To be trapped with a murderer was bad enough, but to be unable to summon help made their situation considerably more precarious. "However," Mr. Pike continued, "Mr. Cole and I have made a thorough inspection of all the doors and windows. The building is secure, and we've posted ourselves to keep watch through the night. No one will be able to leave or enter without our knowledge." Miss Marple wondered privately whether it might not be rather more important to ensure that no one could move about within the building without observation, but she kept this thought to herself. Instead, she resumed her careful study of her companions, noting the way Mrs. Holloway's fingers had unconsciously quickened their pace through the lace pattern, and how Sylvia continued to worry at her scorched gloves. In St. Mary Mead, she had often observed that the truth had a way of revealing itself through the smallest details. A nervous gesture repeated once too often, an inconsistency in a well-rehearsed story, the sort of telling slip that occurred when people were under strain. Tonight, she suspected, would provide ample opportunity for such revelations. Chapter 4. Tangled Threads at Tea Time. Dawn broke grey and forbidding over Turnham Hall, revealing a world transformed by the storm's fury. Snow lay deep across the grounds, sculpted by the wind into fantastic drifts that had completely obliterated the familiar landmarks of drive and garden. Miss Marple, who had spent a largely sleepless night in one of Lady Alicia's guest rooms, stood at her window surveying the scene with the sort of calm acceptance that comes from a lifetime of adapting to circumstances beyond one's control. The household stirred to life with unusual subdued efficiency. Lily appeared with hot water and tea, her pale face bearing witness to an equally restless night, while from somewhere below came the sounds of masculine voices discussing the practical matters of clearing paths and maintaining essential services in their enforced isolation. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the blessed sound of the motor engines announced the arrival of officialdom in the form of Inspector Armitage and his sergeant from Welchester. They had, Miss Marple learned over a hastily assembled breakfast, required the assistance of a farm tractor to navigate the blocked lanes, and even then the journey had been arduous and uncertain. Inspector Armitage proved to be a solid, methodical man of middle years, with the sort of patient manner that Miss Marple had often observed in those who dealt regularly with the darker aspects of human nature. His initial examination of the crime scene was thorough, but yielded little beyond what they had already discovered. Squadron Leader Morton had died from a single thrust of the ivory crochet hook, delivered with considerable force and precision. The interviews began after luncheon, conducted in the library where the inspector had established his temporary headquarters. Miss Marple, as a guest rather than a household member, was among the first to be questioned, though she suspected this was more a courtesy than genuine investigative priority. "I understand you observed the proceedings quite carefully last evening, Miss Marple," Inspector Armitage said, consulting his notes. "Perhaps you noticed something that might assist our inquiries." Miss Marple considered the question thoughtfully. "I'm afraid I must confess to being rather absorbed in watching the people rather than the auction itself, Inspector. At my age one finds human nature considerably more fascinating than material possessions." "Indeed? And what did your observations tell you about the people present?" "Well," Miss Marple said carefully, "I could not help but notice that Squadron Leader Morton seemed particularly interested in the more valuable items being offered. He spent considerable time examining the display tables before the auction began. The inspector made a note. Did he speak to anyone in particular about these items? He had several conversations with Mr. Pike, the travelling merchant. They seemed to be discussing the provenance and value of various pieces, though I was not close enough to overhear the details. This information appeared to interest Inspector Armitage considerably. When Mr. Pike was subsequently called for questioning, his usual smooth demeanour showed signs of strain under official scrutiny. Yes, Inspector, the squadron leader did approach me about several items. He seemed quite knowledgeable about antiques and their current market values. In fact, he mentioned having a buyer for certain types of pieces, someone willing to pay premium prices for items with interesting histories. A buyer? Did he elaborate on this? Pike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was rather mysterious about it, I'm afraid. Said something about having contacts who appreciated fine craftsmanship and weren't particular about paperwork and such formalities. Inspector Armitage's eyebrows rose at this revelation. In Miss Marple's experience, when young men spoke mysteriously about buyers unconcerned with paperwork, the conversation was rarely heading in directions that would bear close official scrutiny. The questioning of Mr. Pike revealed another interesting detail. He admitted to having heard rumours about a particular treasure at Turnham Hall, an ancient pattern book, supposedly dating to the reign of Queen Adelaide, containing designs of considerable historical and monetary value. Such items are quite sought after by collectors, Pike explained. Original pattern books from that period can fetch thousands of pounds at auction, particularly if they can be authenticated as having royal connections. When pressed about whether he had discussed this rumoured pattern book with Squadron Leader Morton, Pike's discomfort became even more pronounced. He may have mentioned it in passing, said he'd heard similar rumours and was curious about their validity. Bernard Cole's interview proved equally illuminating, though in different ways. The veterinary surgeon was clearly struggling with emotions that went far beyond appropriate concern for a mere acquaintance. "I won't pretend I like the man, Inspector," Bernard said with painful honesty. "Squadron Leader Morton was, he was everything I am not. Handsome, confident, successful with the ladies, and he was engaged to marry the woman I—" His voice trailed off and he stared miserably at his hands. "You were fond of Miss Turnham yourself?" "More than fond," Bernard admitted. "I've been in love with Sylvia since we were children. Everyone knew it except, apparently, Sylvia herself. When she announced her engagement to Morton, I behaved rather badly, I'm afraid." Inspector Armitage leaned forward with interest. "In what way, Mr. Cole?" "I confronted him, told him he wasn't good enough for her, that he was only interested in her family's connections and whatever money he thought might come with them. We had quite a row about it, actually, just last week in the village." "And where were you when the lights failed last evening?" "In the billiard room with several other gentlemen. We were examining some of the sporting prints while the ladies conducted their auction. I never left the room until we heard Mr. Pike calling for assistance with the lighting situation." This alibi was subsequently confirmed by the other gentlemen present, though Miss Marple noted with interest that the billiard room was situated at the far end of the house from the great hall, and that the thick stone walls of the old building would have effectively muffled any sounds from the scene of the crime. Mrs. Holloway's interview revealed yet another layer to the evening's complexities. When questioned about her movements during the crucial period, she maintained that she had remained in the great hall throughout the auction, working on her filet lace by candlelight after the electrical failure. "Such beautiful work," Inspector Armitage observed, examining the panel she had brought with her. "You must have accomplished quite a lot yesterday evening." "Thank you, Inspector, though I must confess I completed most of it before the auction began. The light was better earlier in the day, and close work becomes quite difficult once one relies on candles." Miss Marple, who was present during this interview as an observer, found herself studying the lace pattern with renewed interest. If Mrs. Holloway's account was accurate, then Miss Marple's earlier observation about the additional rows must have been mistaken. Yet she was quite certain of what she had seen. The mystery deepened when Lily was called for questioning. The little maid proved to have remarkably sharp powers of observation, despite her unassuming manner. "Oh yes, Inspector, I remember the teapot cosy you're asking about," she said, when questioned about her needlework projects. "It was a gift from Mrs. Holloway, made from some lovely turquoise wool she had left over from another project. Quite fine quality, Angora, I believe." Miss Marple's attention sharpened considerably at this revelation. The turquoise strand found clinging to the murder weapon was indeed Angora, and of exactly the same shade as both Lily's teapot cosy and Sylvia's beautiful shawl. "When did Mrs. Holloway give you this cosy, Lily?" "Oh, some weeks ago now, Inspector. She's very kind that way, always sharing materials and helping with projects. She taught me the stitch pattern used in the border." Inspector Armitage examined the cosy with professional interest. The turquoise wool was indeed identical in colour and texture to the evidence found at the scene, which raised the intriguing question of how many people had access to wool of this particular type and quality. When Mrs. Holloway was recalled and questioned about the wool, her explanation was straightforward enough. "I purchased quite a large quantity of that particular shade some months ago. It was offered at a very advantageous price, and the quality was exceptional. I've used it for several projects and shared it with others who admired the colour." "Others?" "Well, Lily, of course, and I believe Miss Turnham purchased some as well. She was quite taken with the shade and asked where she might obtain similar wool for her own work." This information cast Sylvia's beautiful shawl in an entirely new light. If multiple people had access to the distinctive turquoise wool, then the strand found on the murder weapon might have come from any number of sources. As the afternoon wore on and the interviews continued, a picture began to emerge of tensions and secrets that ran far deeper than the peaceful surface of the previous evening's gathering had suggested. Squadron Leader Morton had been a more complex figure than his charming exterior had revealed, a man with mysterious business contacts and an apparent interest in acquiring valuable items through questionable means. The question that remained was which of their fellow guests had discovered his true nature, and what desperate circumstances had driven them to murder. Chapter 5. The Hook with the Jagged Tip. The second day of their enforced confinement dawned with no improvement in the weather. If anything, the snow seemed to be falling more heavily than before, and the wind continued its relentless assault on the ancient building. Miss Marple, taking her morning tea in the breakfast room, observed that the household was beginning to show signs of strain. Conversations were subdued, glances nervous, and there was an almost palpable sense of tension that seemed to permeate the very walls of Turnham Hall. Inspector Armitage had spent the early hours of the morning conducting a more thorough examination of the crime scene and its immediate surroundings. It was during this methodical search that he made a discovery that would prove to be of considerable significance to the investigation. "Miss Marple," he said, approaching her as she sat quietly in the morning room with her needlework, "I wonder if you might spare a moment to examine something we found. Your eye for detail has already proven quite valuable." She followed him through the snow-covered gardens to the orangery, a charming glass structure that had clearly seen better days. Several panes were cracked, and the heating apparatus had long since fallen into disrepair, but it still served as a repository for garden tools and seasonal equipment. "We found this lodged in the drainage pipe," Inspector Armitage said, producing a small evidence bag containing what was unmistakably one of the missing ivory crochet hooks. It appears to have been deliberately hidden, though the concealment was rather hastily done. Miss Marple examined the hook through the clear material of the bag, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. The implement had clearly suffered damage. The delicate tip was broken off, leaving a sharp, jagged edge that spoke of considerable force having been applied to the ivory. "How very interesting," she murmured, adjusting her spectacles for a closer look. "The break appears to be quite recent, doesn't it? The ivory shows no signs of aging or weathering along the fracture line." "Precisely my own observation," the inspector agreed, "which suggests that whatever caused this damage occurred on the night of the murder, or very shortly before." Miss Marple turned the bag carefully, studying the hook from different angles. "You know, Inspector, this puts me in mind of something Lady Alicia mentioned yesterday evening. She spoke of certain nerves in the old house that affect the electrical system during storms." Inspector Armitage looked puzzled. "Nerve, Miss Marple?" Oh, I believe she was referring to the wiring, Inspector. Old houses often have rather temperamental electrical systems, and Lady Alicia seemed to suggest that the hall's lighting was particularly susceptible to disruption during severe weather. The inspector's expression sharpened with interest. Are you suggesting a connection between this damaged hook and the power failure? Well, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, it did occur to me that a metal object inserted into electrical wiring might well cause both a power failure and damage to the object itself. The scorch marks we observed on poor Squadron Leader Morton's sleeve might support such a theory. But this hook is ivory, not metal, the inspector pointed out. Indeed, which makes the situation all the more puzzling. Ivory, as I understand it, does not conduct electricity in the same manner as metal. Yet here we have clear evidence of damage that might well have been caused by electrical contact. Inspector Armitage studied the hook with renewed attention. You're suggesting that someone used a different implement to cause the power failure, then substituted this ivory hook afterward. It would explain both the timing of the electrical failure and the condition of this particular hook, Miss Marple observed. Though I confess I cannot immediately see why anyone would go to such elaborate lengths simply to plunge the building into darkness. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Fielding, who had been dispatched to check on the condition of the electrical systems throughout the house. His report was both illuminating and disturbing. Inspector, sir, I've found something you ought to see. In the library, near where the main electrical panel is housed, there are clear signs of tampering, scorch marks on the wall, and what looks like metal filings scattered about the floor. The three of them made their way to the library, where Tom's discovery proved even more significant than Miss Marple had anticipated. The electrical panel, housed in an alcove behind a decorative screen, showed unmistakable evidence of deliberate interference. Burn marks scarred the wall around the main fuse box, and scattered on the floor were tiny fragments of what appeared to be silver-coloured metal. Someone definitely caused that power failure deliberately, Inspector Armitage concluded grimly. The question is, who had the knowledge and opportunity to do so? Miss Marple bent to examine the metal fragments more closely, though she was careful not to disturb what might prove to be evidence. These appear to be quite fine pieces, Inspector, almost like shavings from some delicate metal work. Could they have come from one of those crochet hooks, the inspector wondered? The silver handles, perhaps? Possibly, Miss Marple agreed, though something in the back of her mind suggested a different explanation. The fragments reminded her of something, though she could not immediately place what it might be. As they continued their examination of the library, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the damaged cabinet that had housed the ivory hooks. In daylight, the extent of the vandalism was even more apparent than it had been by candlelight. The lock had been forced with considerable violence, and the glass front was completely shattered. "I noticed the glass is broken outward," she observed to Inspector Armitage. "That suggests the force came from within the cabinet, rather than from someone attempting to break in from outside." "An interesting point," the inspector agreed, "though I'm not certain what to make of it." Miss Marple was beginning to form a theory, though she kept her thoughts to herself for the moment. The pattern of evidence was suggesting a sequence of events quite different from what had initially appeared, and she wanted to examine her reasoning more carefully before sharing it with the authorities. Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Alicia, who appeared in the doorway of the library looking rather distressed. "Inspector Armitage, I do apologise for disturbing you, but I felt I should mention something that has been troubling me about the electrical system and the problems we've been having with it recently. Please, Lady Alicia, any information you can provide may be helpful." "Well, it's just that we've had several episodes recently where the lights have flickered or failed entirely, particularly during storms. Our local electrician suggested that the old wiring was becoming dangerous and should be replaced, but—" She paused, looking embarrassed. "I'm afraid the expense has been rather beyond our means at present. Has anyone else been aware of these electrical difficulties?" "Oh yes, everyone in the household knows about them. We've all learned to keep candles readily available and to be cautious about using too many electrical appliances at once. Even our guests last evening were warned about the temperamental nature of the system." This revelation cast the previous evening's power failure in an entirely new light. If the electrical problems were well known to everyone present, then the deliberate nature of the failure suggested someone had taken advantage of existing vulnerabilities in the system. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the metal fragments on the library floor and of the jagged tip of the damaged ivory hook. A picture was beginning to form in her mind of exactly how the evening's tragic events had unfolded, though she still lacked several crucial pieces of information. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I wonder if it might be possible to determine whether any of the remaining ivory hooks show signs of recent handling. Ivory, I believe, can retain fingerprints quite well under certain conditions." "An excellent suggestion, Miss Marple. I'll have our forensics expert examine them immediately." As they prepared to leave the library, Miss Marple took one final look around the room, her experienced eye cataloguing every detail. Something here held the key to understanding not just how the murder had been accomplished, but why it had been necessary. And she was beginning to suspect that the motive was considerably more complex than simple theft or passion. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Pattern Book. The afternoon brought an unexpected development that would prove to shift the entire focus of Inspector Armitage's investigation. While conducting a thorough search of Squadron Leader Morton's quarters, a modest room in the guest wing that Lady Alicia had assigned to him for the duration of his visit, the inspector made a discovery that cast the young man's presence at Turnham Hall in an entirely new light. Hidden beneath the mattress of his bed, carefully wrapped in an oiled cloth, were several torn pages from what appeared to be an antique pattern book. The yellowed paper bore the unmistakable watermark and crest of the Turnham family, and the delicate illustrations showed intricate lace designs of extraordinary complexity and beauty. Miss Marple, who had been invited to examine the discovery due to her expertise in needlework, studied the pages with growing fascination. The patterns themselves were clearly the work of a master craftsman, executed with the sort of precision and artistry that had made English lace famous throughout Europe during the early Victorian period. "These are quite extraordinary," she murmured, adjusting her spectacles to examine the fine details more closely. "The technique shown here is incredibly sophisticated, far beyond anything one typically sees in modern pattern books." Inspector Armitage pointed to the margins of the pages, where cryptic notations had been added in what appeared to be a different hand. "Can you make any sense of these markings, Miss Marple?" She studied the mysterious symbols and abbreviated words with careful attention. "They appear to be some form of shorthand, Inspector, though not of any system I immediately recognise. The style suggests they might date from the 19th century. There were several specialised forms of notation used by professional seamstresses and pattern makers during that period." "Professional notation?" "Oh yes, Inspector. The great fashion houses and royal dressmakers often developed their own systems for recording specific techniques and measurements. Such information would have been closely guarded trade secrets, passed down from master to apprentice." The implications of this discovery were immediately apparent to both of them. If Squadron Leader Morton had been in possession of authentic pattern pages bearing the Turnham crest, then his interest in the Hall's treasures had been far from casual. Moreover, the torn condition of the pages suggested they had been removed from a larger volume with some violence, hardly the action of someone who had come by them honestly. Inspector Armitage's next step was to confront Mrs. Holloway with the discovery, given her acknowledged expertise in historical lace techniques. Her reaction to seeing the pages was immediate and dramatic. She turned quite pale and seemed to sway slightly on her feet before recovering her composure. "Where did you find these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you know very well where they came from, Mrs. Holloway," the inspector replied sternly. "The question is how Squadron Leader Morton came to possess them, and whether you were aware of his theft." Mrs. Holloway sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she stared at the torn pages. "They're from the Queen Adelaide collection," she said finally. "I should have known. I should have realised what he was planning." "Queen Adelaide collection?" "The pattern book that Mr. Pike mentioned yesterday. It's quite real, Inspector, and far more valuable than anyone imagines. My great-grandmother was Mary Holloway, principal lace-maker to Queen Adelaide herself, When the Queen died, my ancestor was commissioned to create a memorial collection of the finest patterns she had developed during her service to the royal household. Miss Marple leaned forward with keen interest. And this collection has remained in your family's possession? Not exactly, Mrs. Holloway replied, her voice heavy with old grief. When my great-grandmother died, the pattern book was sold to settle debts. It eventually came into the possession of the Turnham family, where it has remained as part of their library collection for nearly a century. Inspector Armitage consulted his notes. But you knew of its existence and its value? Oh yes, Inspector, I've known about it all my life. It was something of a family legend, you might say. When I was widowed and left with very little, I approached Lady Alicia about the possibility of viewing the collection. She was most gracious and allowed me to study the patterns extensively. And you realise their monetary value? Mrs. Holloway's face flushed with indignation. Their historical value, Inspector. These patterns represent techniques that have been completely lost to modern lace-making. They're irreplaceable documents of our craft heritage. Miss Marple had been studying the torn pages more closely during this exchange, and now she looked up with a troubled expression. Mrs. Holloway, I noticed that some of these marginalia appear to be in a more recent hand than the original patterns. Would you happen to know anything about these annotations? The older woman's flush deepened, and she seemed to struggle with some internal conflict before answering. I may have made some notes during my studies. The shorthand notations record specific techniques that weren't fully explained in the original patterns. I hoped that someday I might be able to use the information to recreate some of the lost methods. So you are familiar with Squadron Leader Morton's interest in these patterns? He approached me several weeks ago, Mrs. Holloway admitted reluctantly. He'd heard rumours about the collection and wanted to know if they were true. I tried to discourage his interest, but he was quite persistent. He seemed to know a great deal about the antique market for such items. Inspector Armitage made careful notes as she spoke. Did he mention his mysterious buyer to you? He claimed to have contacts among private collectors who would pay enormous sums for authenticated royal patterns. He said such items rarely came on the market, and when they did, provenance was often questionable. But these, with the Turnham crest and my family's connection to Queen Adelaide... She shook her head miserably. He said they could be worth thousands of pounds to the right buyer. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the conversation she'd overheard between Mr. Pike and Squadron Leader Morton. Mrs. Holloway, did you tell anyone else about Mr. Morton's interest in the pattern book? I may have mentioned it to Lady Alicia. I was concerned about the security of the collection, and I thought she should be aware that outsiders knew of its existence. And when did this conversation take place? Several days ago. I was quite worried about it, actually. Lady Alicia seemed distressed by the news, though she tried to hide it. I think she realised that financial pressures might eventually force her to sell the collection, and she was troubled by the idea of it leaving the family. Inspector Armitage looked up sharply from his notes. Did she mention any specific financial difficulties? Mrs. Holloway hesitated before answering. The whole circumstances are challenging, Inspector. There have been rumours about mounting debts, and the need to sell various family treasures to meet obligations. I believe Lady Alicia has been trying to keep the extent of the difficulties from her niece, but servants talk, and word gets around in a small community. This revelation cast both Lady Alicia's situation and her niece's recent engagement in a new light. Miss Marple found herself wondering whether Squadron Leader Morton's interest in Sylvia Turnham had been entirely romantic, or whether he had seen in her an opportunity to gain access to the Hall's treasures. Mrs. Holloway, she said gently, when you confronted Squadron Leader Morton about his plans for the pattern book, how did he respond? He was quite unpleasant about it, actually. Said that old patterns gathering dust in a library weren't doing anyone any good, and that people like me who hoarded knowledge were standing in the way of progress. He claimed that selling the collection would actually benefit scholarship by making the patterns available to serious researchers. But you didn't believe his motives were scholarly? Hardly, Mrs. Holloway replied with some heat. He spoke far too knowledgeably about market values and private collectors for someone with purely academic interests, and when I suggested he approach Lady Alicia directly about purchasing the collection, he became quite evasive. Inspector Armitage closed his notebook with a decisive snap. I think we need to have another conversation with Lady Alicia about this pattern book and about what she may have known regarding Squadron Leader Morton's true interests. As they prepared to leave the room, Miss Marple took one final look at the torn pages spread across the table. The delicate beauty of the pattern seemed somehow tainted now by the knowledge of the greed and deception that had surrounded them. She found herself thinking that it was often the most beautiful things that inspired the ugliest human impulses, and wondering what other secrets might yet be hiding in the shadowy corners of Turnham Hall. Chapter 7, Midnight. Unravelling. The third night of their confinement at Turnham Hall proved to be the most eventful yet. Miss Marple, who had always been a light sleeper, was awakened shortly after midnight by the sound of stealthy footsteps in the corridor outside her room. Years of experience in St. Mary Mead had taught her that people who moved about in the dead of night rarely had innocent purposes in mind, and she found herself quite unable to return to sleep until she had satisfied her curiosity about the identity of the nocturnal wanderer. Wrapping her dressing gown securely about her and slipping her feet into warm slippers, Miss Marple opened her door with the sort of careful silence that comes from a lifetime of observing human nature in its less guarded moments. The corridor was dimly lit by a single electric bulb that cast long shadows between the doorways, but she could just make out a figure moving cautiously toward the main staircase. The shape was too tall to be Lily, and the bearing too masculine to be one of the other ladies. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, Miss Marple realised with considerable interest that the mysterious figure was carrying what appeared to be a small electric torch, its beam carefully shielded to avoid detection. Rather than confront the prowler directly, an action that might prove unwise given recent events, Miss Marple decided to follow at a discreet distance. Her soft slippers made no sound on the ancient wooden floors, and she was able to keep the moving figure in sight as it descended the main staircase and made its way toward the library wing of the house. At the foot of the stairs she encountered an unexpected ally in the form of Lily, who emerged from the servants' stair with a shawl thrown over her nightgown and an expression of alert concern on her pale face. "Miss Marple," the little maid whispered urgently, "I heard someone moving about. Do you think we should wake Inspector Armitage?" "In a moment, dear," Miss Marple replied quietly. "First let us see what our mysterious visitor is seeking. Sometimes it's more instructive to observe than to intervene." Together they crept through the darkened corridors toward the library, guided by the occasional flash of torchlight from their quarry. The ancient building seemed to amplify every small sound, the creaking of floorboards, the whisper of their breathing, the distant howling of the wind that continued its assault on the hall's weathered walls. When they reached the library doorway, Miss Marple peered carefully around the frame and was startled to discover that their nocturnal visitor was none other than Bernard Cole. The veterinary surgeon was systematically searching through the desk drawers with a sort of methodical precision that suggested he was looking for something specific. Miss Marple watched with fascination as Bernard examined various papers and documents, clearly frustrated by his inability to locate whatever he sought. His movements became increasingly urgent, and she could see perspiration on his brow despite the chill of the unheated room. It was then that Lily made the small sound of distress that betrayed their presence. Bernard spun around, his torch beam catching them full in the face, and for a moment the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of mutual surprise. "Mr. Cole," Miss Marple said with admirable composure, "I do hope you haven't lost something important. Perhaps we might assist you in your search." Bernard's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: guilt, embarrassment, and finally a sort of desperate resignation. "Miss Marple, this isn't what it appears to be." "Indeed? And what does it appear to be, Mr. Cole?" "It appears that I'm behaving like a common burglar," he said miserably, switching off his torch and slumping into one of the leather chairs. "Though I suppose that's exactly what I am doing." Miss Marple moved into the room with Lily close behind her, and settled herself in the chair opposite Bernard, with a sort of calm authority that seemed to invite confession. "I suspect your motives are considerably more noble than those of a common burglar," she said gently. "Would you care to tell us what you're really looking for?" Bernard ran his hands through his hair, leaving it in dishevelled spikes. "The pattern book," he admitted finally. "I was trying to find Lady Alicia's pattern book before anyone else could get their hands on it. Before anyone else could get their hands on it. I overheard Pike talking to someone earlier today. I think it was on the telephone before the lines went down completely. He was making arrangements to have the book evaluated by his mysterious contacts. I realised that Sylvia might lose her inheritance to these vultures if something wasn't done to protect it." Miss Marple found this explanation both touching and troubling. "So you decided to take matters into your own hands?" "I thought if I could secure the book temporarily, at least until the road's clear and proper legal advice can be obtained." He shrugged helplessly. "I suppose it was a foolish plan, but I couldn't bear the thought of Sylvia being cheated out of what might be her only remaining asset." Before Miss Marple could respond to this declaration, their conversation was interrupted by a series of sounds that sent all three of them rushing toward the windows. Shouts could be heard from somewhere else in the building, accompanied by the distinct smell of smoke that spoke of fire rather than merely a poorly drawing chimney. "The curtains," Lily gasped, pointing toward the far end of the library where an ominous orange glow was beginning to flicker against the ancient damask hangings. "Someone's pushed a candle too close to the fabric." The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity as the three of them worked frantically to contain the spreading flames. Bernard proved surprisingly adept at firefighting, directing their efforts with the sort of calm competence that Miss Marple associated with those accustomed to dealing with emergencies. Lily fetched water from the washstand in the adjacent powder room, while Miss Marple used a poker to pull down the burning sections of curtain before the fire could spread to the wooden window frames. It was during this frantic activity that Miss Marple made two observations that would prove significant to the investigation. First, she noticed that the candle which had apparently caused the conflagration was not one of the household's usual implements, but rather a small votive candle of the type used in churches, hardly the sort of thing one would normally find in a private library. Second, and more importantly, she observed several strands of turquoise wool caught on the window catch, as though someone had brushed against it while opening or closing the casement. The wool was unmistakably the same fine angora that had been found on the murder weapon, and that featured so prominently in both Sylvia's shawl and Lily's teapot cosy. By the time Inspector Armitage and the other household members had been roused by the commotion, the fire was under control, though the library bore the scars of the encounter. The damaged curtains hung in blackened tatters, and the acrid smell of smoke permeated the entire wing of the house. "Most fortunate that you were awake to deal with this so promptly," the inspector observed, surveying the damage with a professional eye. "Though I must say it's rather curious that so many people seem to have been wandering about the house at this hour." Miss Marple exchanged glances with Lily and Bernard, recognising the unspoken question in the inspector's words. The official explanation, that Bernard had been unable to sleep and had come to the library to find a book, while she and Lily had been awakened by the sounds of the fire, was accepted without further comment, though she suspected Inspector Armitage was filing away certain details for future consideration. As they prepared to retire once again to their respective rooms, Miss Marple took one final look around the damaged library. The pattern book that Bernard had been seeking was nowhere to be found among the visible volumes, though whether this was because it had been moved to safety, or because someone else had already claimed it, remained to be determined. The turquoise wool fibres on the window catch glinted in the lamplight like tiny accusations, and Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the fire had been a deliberate attempt to destroy evidence, or merely an unfortunate accident that had revealed more than the perpetrator intended. Either way, she was beginning to see a pattern emerging from the chaos of recent events, a pattern as intricate and deliberate as any of the lace designs that had brought them all together in the first place. Chapter 8. A Snag in the Alibi. The morning after the library fire dawned grey and dispiriting, with snow still falling steadily beyond the frost-etched windows. Miss Marple found herself in the unusual position of being awake before the household stirred, her mind too active with the previous night's revelations to permit restful sleep. She sat by her bedroom window with a cup of tea that Lily had thoughtfully provided, watching the snow accumulate in the courtyard below, while methodically reviewing the sequence of events that had brought them to their current predicament. It was during this quiet contemplation that she began to perceive certain inconsistencies in the various accounts she'd heard over the past few days. Like a seamstress examining a piece of work for dropped stitches or uneven tension, Miss Marple found herself mentally retracing the timeline of the murder evening, paying particular attention to the small details that others might have overlooked. The question of Mrs. Holloway's additional crochet rows had been troubling her considerably. When first questioned by Inspector Armitage, the widow had maintained that she had completed most of her filet-lace panel before supper, claiming to have rested her eyes during the crucial period when the murder occurred. Yet Miss Marple distinctly remembered observing at least 3 additional rows of the intricate pattern after the auction had begun. This morning, however, as she sat quietly piecing together the fragments of memory, a different explanation began to suggest itself. Perhaps Mrs. Holloway had indeed been telling the truth about when she completed the extra rows, but not about the purpose for which they had been created. Miss Marple recalled the way Mrs. Holloway had held up her work during the early part of the evening, demonstrating the technique to the other ladies with a sort of practised ease that came from years of teaching. It was entirely possible that those 3 additional rows had been added during that demonstration, as an illustration of how the pattern developed. If so, then Mrs. Holloway's alibi for the crucial time period remained intact. This realization led Miss Marple to reconsider other elements of the evidence with fresh eyes. Bernard Cole's motive of jealousy, while genuine enough, had always struck her as rather too obvious for a man of his evident intelligence and professional training. Moreover, his alibi for the time of the murder had been corroborated by several reliable witnesses, all of whom testified that he had never left the billiard room during the critical period. The question of the turquoise wool fibres, however, presented a more complex puzzle. The strands had been found in 3 separate locations, clinging to the murder weapon, caught on the library window catch, and incorporated into Lily's teapot cosy. While Mrs. Holloway had explained that she had shared the distinctive wool with others, only one person had been observed wearing a garment made from that particular material on the evening in question. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the memory of Sylvia Turnham's beautiful Angora shawl, with its long decorative tassels that had complemented her ensemble so elegantly. She recalled noticing that one of those tassels appeared to have been recently mended, though at the time she had thought little of it beyond admiring the neat repair work. Now, however, she found herself wondering whether that mending might have been necessitated by something more dramatic than ordinary wear and tear. If one of the tassels had been caught and torn during some violent struggle, it would explain both the presence of turquoise fibres at the crime scene and the careful repair she had observed. When Inspector Armitage made his morning rounds, Miss Marple shared these observations with him in the privacy of the library, where the smell of smoke still lingered despite the servant's best efforts at airing the room. "You raise interesting points, Miss Marple," the inspector said thoughtfully, making notes in his ever-present notebook. "Though I must admit I'm puzzled by one aspect of your theory. If Miss Turnham was indeed involved in the murder, why would she have worn such a distinctive garment? Surely she would have realized that the fibres might be traced back to her." "Ah, but you see, Inspector, that assumes the crime was premeditated in every detail. What if the actual murder was somewhat more spontaneous than we have supposed? The elaborate preparation with the electrical system suggests careful planning, but the choice of weapon and the manner of the killing might indicate that events developed more quickly than the perpetrator had anticipated." Inspector Armitage considered this carefully. "You're suggesting that someone planned to create the blackout for one purpose, but then found themselves committing murder for quite different reasons? It's possible, isn't it? Perhaps the original plan involved nothing more than theft, an opportunity to remove valuable items under cover of darkness. But when Squadron Leader Morton discovered what was happening, he would have confronted the thief, leading to a struggle and his eventual death. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Exactly. And in such circumstances one might not have the leisure to consider the evidentiary implications of one's clothing choices. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lily, who appeared in the doorway with her usual quiet efficiency, but an expression of some distress. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but Lady Alicia would like to speak with you when convenient. She says it's about Miss Sylvia's shawl." Inspector Armitage and Miss Marple exchanged meaningful glances before following Lily to the morning room, where they found Lady Alicia waiting with obvious agitation. Beside her chair sat a wicker sewing basket, and Miss Marple could see the familiar turquoise wool of Sylvia's shawl folded neatly within it. "Inspector," Lady Alicia began without preamble, "I felt I must bring this to your attention, though it pains me greatly to do so. I found Sylvia's shawl this morning while tidying her room, and I noticed—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "What did you notice, Lady Alicia?" "One of the tassels is missing entirely. Not mended, as I had thought when I glimpsed it the other evening, but completely gone. The edge has been carefully finished to disguise the fact, but there's no question that a substantial piece of the fringe has been removed." Miss Marple examined the shawl with professional interest, noting the skillful way in which the missing tassel had been concealed. Only someone with considerable experience in needlework would have been capable of such neat repair work, and the fact that it had been done with such care suggested that the person responsible had been very much aware of the significance of the missing fringe. "Lady Alicia," Inspector Armitage said gently, "do you know when this damage might have occurred?" "I'm afraid I noticed it yesterday morning, actually, but I assumed it was simply a minor accident that Sylvia had repaired herself. She's always been quite accomplished with a needle. It wasn't until last night, after the business with the library fire and finding those wool fibres on the window catch, that I began to wonder—" Her voice trailed off, but her meaning was clear enough. The implications of the missing tassel, combined with the other evidence they had gathered, were beginning to paint a picture that none of them wanted to acknowledge. "Where is Miss Turnham now?" the inspector inquired. "In her room, I believe. She's been quite subdued since the fire last night, and she complained of a headache this morning." Miss Marple found herself thinking of the young woman's behaviour over the past few days. The nervous energy she had displayed, the way her attention had wandered during conversations, the obvious strain that had shown in her face and manner. At the time, she had attributed these signs to the natural distress of someone who had lost her fiancé under such shocking circumstances. Now, however, she wondered whether guilt rather than grief might have been the primary emotion driving Sylvia's distress. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe it may be time to have a more detailed conversation with Miss Turnham about her movements on the evening of the murder, and perhaps we should also inquire more specifically about her knowledge of the hall's electrical systems." Inspector Armitage nodded grimly, closing his notebook with the decisive snap that Miss Marple had come to recognise as a sign that he was preparing to take action. The web of evidence was finally beginning to tighten around their quarry, and she suspected that the truth would soon be revealed in all its tragic complexity. Chapter 9. The Final Stitch at St Mary Mead. By Thursday morning the storm had finally begun to exhaust itself, though the snow continued to fall in desultory flakes that drifted past the windows like fragments of a spent fury. The roads remained impassable, but Tom Fielding reported with cautious optimism that the main lane might be cleared by afternoon if the weather continued to improve. It was then that Miss Marple made an unexpected proposal that surprised everyone present, including Inspector Armitage. "I wonder," she said thoughtfully over breakfast, "whether our party might not benefit from a change of scene. The atmosphere here has become rather oppressive, and I find that sometimes a brief respite can help clarify one's thoughts remarkably." Lady Alicia looked puzzled. "But my dear Miss Marple, surely we cannot venture far in these conditions." "Oh, I wasn't thinking of anything ambitious," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "Merely a short expedition to St Mary Mead, once the lane is cleared. My cottage is quite modest, but I should be delighted to offer tea and perhaps a bit of that excellent cake Mrs. Bantry was kind enough to send over before all this dreadful business began." Inspector Armitage raised an eyebrow at this suggestion. "Miss Marple, while I appreciate the gesture, I'm not certain it would be wise to relocate the entire party while the investigation remains ongoing." "Oh, I quite understand your concerns, Inspector. I was thinking more of a small gathering. Perhaps just the ladies who shared our crochet circle, and Mr. Cole, of course. A sort of therapeutic exercise to help restore our equilibrium after such traumatic events." There was something in Miss Marple's tone that suggested this invitation was not quite as innocent as it appeared, and Inspector Armitage found himself studying her with renewed attention. In his experience, elderly ladies who made seemingly casual suggestions during murder investigations were rarely acting from purely social motives. "What exactly did you have in mind, Miss Marple?" "Well, I thought it might be rather soothing to continue with our needlework projects. I have quite a nice collection of hooks and implements at home, and I noticed that our recent difficulties have left some of us without proper tools for our crafts. It seems such a pity to let our work languish when a simple solution is at hand." Lady Alicia seized upon this suggestion with evident relief. "What a perfectly splendid idea. I'm sure we could all benefit from returning to normal activities, even briefly. And Sylvia particularly seemed so distressed." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with something that might have been anticipation. "Yes, dear Sylvia does seem to have been rather affected by recent events. I do hope a bit of familiar routine might help restore her spirits." By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Tom Fielding had succeeded in clearing a narrow passage through the drifted snow, and Miss Marple's unusual tea party set forth from Turnham Hall in a small convoy of vehicles. The group consisted of Lady Alicia, Sylvia, Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Cole, and Inspector Armitage, who had decided that his professional obligations required him to accompany the party, despite his reservations about the enterprise. Miss Marple's cottage proved to be exactly what one might expect from its owner: small, immaculately maintained, and filled with the sort of comfortable furniture that invited confidences. The sitting room was warmed by a cheerful fire, and the tea table was laid with her best china and an impressive array of cakes and sandwiches that suggested considerable advanced preparation. "Now then," Miss Marple said once everyone was settled with tea and cake, "I thought we might return to our needlework as a way of settling our nerves. I have here a selection of hooks and implements that you're quite welcome to use." She produced a small wooden box from her work basket and opened it to reveal an assortment of crochet hooks in various materials: steel, bone, and ivory. Among them was one piece that immediately caught the attention of those present: an ivory hook whose tip had been deliberately modified to create a sharp, jagged edge. "How interesting," Mrs. Holloway observed, leaning forward to examine the implement. "I don't believe I've seen a hook with that particular modification before." "Oh, that one has quite a story," Miss Marple replied with apparent casualness. "I damaged it myself some years ago in a rather foolish accident involving electrical work. The tip broke off in the most peculiar way, leaving this jagged edge that can be quite dangerous if one isn't careful." She lifted the modified hook from the box and turned it thoughtfully in her hands. "It's curious how such a small flaw can make an otherwise useful tool quite treacherous. One has to handle it with extreme care to avoid injury." As she spoke, Miss Marple's eyes moved meaningfully around the room, settling finally on Sylvia Turnham, who had gone quite pale and was staring at the modified hook with unmistakable recognition. "Sylvia, dear," Miss Marple said gently, extending the hook toward her, "would you care to try working with this one? I'd be most interested in your opinion of how the damage affects its usefulness." Sylvia's reaction was immediate and telling. She drew back sharply from the offered implement, her hands instinctively rising to protect herself. "No, I'd rather not. I don't care for hooks with sharp edges." "How very wise of you," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Sharp edges can cause such nasty injuries, can't they? Particularly if one handles them carelessly." She set the hook aside and reached for another implement, but the damage was done. Sylvia's involuntary response had revealed a familiarity with jagged-edged hooks that could hardly be coincidental, and everyone in the room had witnessed her reaction. Inspector Armitage cleared his throat meaningfully. "Miss Turnham, I wonder if we might have a private conversation about your recollections of the evening in question. There are a few details I'd like to clarify." "I don't see why that should be necessary," Sylvia replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "I've already told you everything I remember." "Have you indeed?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Because I've been thinking quite a lot about that evening, and I find myself with several questions that might benefit from your unique perspective." She rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered garden with the sort of contemplative expression that her neighbours in St. Mary Mead had learned to recognise as the prelude to uncomfortable revelations. "You see," she continued conversationally, "I've been puzzling over the question of how someone could have caused that electrical failure with such perfect timing. It would require considerable knowledge of the hall's wiring system, wouldn't it? The sort of knowledge that might come from, say, having grown up in the house and observed various repairs over the years." Sylvia's composure was beginning to crack visibly. "I don't know what you're suggesting." "Oh, I think you do, dear," Miss Marple replied sadly. "Just as I think you know exactly why the tip of that ivory hook was jagged, and how such a modification might be created by someone who had experimented with using similar implements to interfere with the electrical systems." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the whisper of snow against the windows. Finally, Inspector Armitage rose from his chair with the air of a man who had reached an inevitable conclusion. "Miss Turnham," he said formally, "I believe the time has come for us to discuss this matter in greater detail, and I think it would be best if we return to Turnham Hall for that conversation." Miss Marple turned from the window, her face filled with infinite sadness. "I'm so very sorry, Sylvia," she said quietly. "But the truth has a way of emerging, doesn't it? Rather like stitches in a piece of needlework. However carefully one tries to hide the irregularities, they always show through in the end." Chapter 10. The Woolen Web Revealed. The journey back to Turnham Hall was accomplished in heavy silence, the weight of unspoken accusations hanging over the small party like the lowering clouds that still threatened fresh snow. Sylvia sat rigid beside her aunt in the back seat of Inspector Armitage's motor car, her face pale but composed, as though she had retreated into some inner fortress where the approaching storm of revelation could not touch her. Once they had assembled in the long gallery, that magnificent chamber where generations of Turnhams had entertained their guests in happier times, Miss Marple took her place before the ornate fireplace with a sort of quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. The others arranged themselves in chairs and settees, their faces reflecting varying degrees of apprehension, curiosity and dread. Inspector Armitage stood to one side, his notebook ready, while Lady Alicia clutched her niece's hand with desperate tenderness. Mrs. Holloway had positioned herself near the windows, her needlework forgotten in her lap, and Bernard Cole sat forward in his chair with the tense alertness of a man preparing to hear his worst fears confirmed. "I find," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice, "that murder is rather like a complicated piece of needlework. At first glance, one sees only the confusion of threads and patterns, but when one examines it carefully, stitch by stitch as it were, a clear design begins to emerge." She paused to adjust her spectacles, her eyes moving thoughtfully around the assembled company. In this case, we were presented with what appeared to be a crime of passion or opportunity. A young man killed during a power failure, apparently by someone who had seized upon the chaos to commit theft and murder. But the more closely I examined the evidence, the more I became convinced that we were dealing with something far more deliberate and complex. Lady Alicia's grip on Sylvia's hand tightened visibly. "Miss Marple, surely you cannot believe that anyone in our household—" "I'm afraid I must, Lady Alicia," Miss Marple replied with infinite gentleness. "You see, the sequence of events that led to Squadron Leader Morton's death was far too carefully orchestrated to have been accidental. Someone planned that murder with considerable forethought, taking advantage of circumstances that only a person intimately familiar with this house could have known about. She began to pace slowly before the fireplace, her hands clasped behind her back in the manner of one organising complex thoughts. Let us begin with the electrical failure, which was clearly the cornerstone of the entire plan. As we discovered, someone deliberately caused that blackout by jamming a metal object into the wiring, an action that required specific knowledge of where the electrical panels were located and how they might be safely manipulated. Inspector Armitage consulted his notes. The metal fragments we found in the library suggested that a silver-handled implement had been used for this purpose. Precisely, Inspector. One of the ivory crochet hooks with its decorative silver handle. An implement that would conduct electricity effectively and create exactly the sort of short circuit needed to plunge the building into darkness. But here we encounter our first significant clue. The hook used to cause the electrical failure was subsequently replaced with a different hook, one made entirely of ivory. Miss Marple turned to face Sylvia directly, her blue eyes compassionate but unrelenting. This substitution was necessary because the metal hook had been damaged by the electrical discharge, its tip broken and jagged from the violence of the short circuit. Such damage would have been immediately recognizable as evidence of electrical tampering, so a replacement weapon had to be procured, one that would serve the murderer's purpose while concealing the true method by which the blackout had been achieved. Sylvia remained silent, but her face had gone deathly pale, and Miss Marple could see her hands trembling despite her efforts at self-control. The murderer's plan, Miss Marple continued, was both clever and desperate. Sylvia Turnham found herself in possession of knowledge that made Squadron Leader Morton's presence at Turnham Hall extremely dangerous to her family's welfare. Through her access to the household's private papers and her aunt's confidences, she knew about the Queen Adelaide pattern book and its enormous value to collectors. She also knew that Philip Morton was not the charming suitor he appeared to be, but rather a calculating fortune hunter who had learned of the pattern book's existence and intended to steal it. Lady Alicia gasped audibly. No, surely Philip wouldn't have. I'm afraid he would, Lady Alicia. The torn pages found in his quarters prove that he had already begun putting his plan into action. But Sylvia discovered his true intentions, perhaps by overhearing his conversations with Mr. Pike, or finding evidence of his communications with potential buyers. She realized that her family faced financial ruin not only from their existing debts, but from the loss of their most valuable remaining asset. Miss Marple paused in her pacing, her expression infinitely sad. What Sylvia failed to realise was that Philip had decided to alter his plans. Rather than simply stealing the pattern book, he had chosen to propose marriage as a more elegant solution, one that would give him legal access to the Turnham treasures while maintaining his relationship with the family. When Sylvia confronted him about his interest in the pattern book, he revealed this new scheme, no doubt believing she would be grateful for his willingness to legitimise his acquisition of her inheritance. Bernard Cole leaned forward urgently, but surely that would have been preferable to theft. Not from Sylvia's perspective, Mr. Cole. You see, she had already discovered that Philip's mysterious buyer was not interested in a legitimate purchase. The pattern book was to be smuggled out of the country and sold to private collectors who cared nothing for its historical significance or legal provenance. Even marriage to Philip would not have prevented this fate. Indeed, it would have made the theft legally unassailable. Miss Marple's voice grew gentler as she continued. So Sylvia made the desperate decision to prevent this catastrophe by any means necessary. She used her childhood knowledge of the hall's electrical system to stage the blackout, then lured Philip to the tapestry storeroom, where she confronted him with evidence of his true plans. When he refused to abandon his scheme, she struck him with the jagged ivory hook that she had prepared for precisely this purpose. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Lady Alicia's quiet sobbing and the whisper of wind around the ancient walls. Finally Sylvia spoke, her voice barely audible but clear. "He laughed at me," she said simply. "When I told him I knew what he was planning, when I begged him to leave our family in peace, he laughed. He said I was a foolish girl who didn't understand the realities of the modern world, and that the pattern book would do far more good in the hands of people who truly appreciated its value." Inspector Armitage stepped forward. "Miss Turnham, I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence against you." Sylvia nodded with weary acceptance. "I understand, Inspector, and I suppose it's time for the truth to come out completely?" She turned to her aunt with infinite regret. "I'm so sorry, Aunt Alicia. I never meant for any of this to happen. I only wanted to protect our family's heritage." Miss Marple moved to the window and gazed out at the snow-covered grounds, her voice soft with understanding. "The tragedy of this case is that it might all have been avoided with honest communication. If Sylvia had confided her discoveries to Lady Alicia, or sought proper legal advice about protecting the pattern book, Squadron Leader Morton's theft could have been prevented without violence." She turned back to the room, her eyes filled with infinite compassion. But desperation makes us all capable of actions we would never contemplate under ordinary circumstances. Like Crochet itself, every crime begins with a single loop, a moment of decision that seems simple at the time. It is only when we attempt to undo the damage that we discover how tightly the threads have become entangled, and how impossible it is to return to the original pattern. As Inspector Armitage began the formal process of arrest, Miss Marple reflected sadly that another family's peace had been destroyed by the twin demons of greed and desperation. Yet she could not help but feel that some measure of justice had been served, and that the truth, however painful, was always preferable to the corrosive uncertainty that murder invariably left in its wake.